Yeah, exactly. Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club. My name is Thomas Burr. I'm a Washington correspondent for the Salt Lake Tribune and chairman of the National Press Club's Board of Governors. The National Press Club is the world's leading professional organization for journalists, committed to our profession's future through programming with events such as this while fostering a free press worldwide. For more information about the National Press Club, please visit our website at www.press.org. To donate to programs offered to the public through the National Press Club Journalism Institute, please visit www.press.org/institute. On behalf of our members worldwide, I'd like to welcome our speaker and those of you attending today's event. Our head table includes guests of the speaker, as well as working journalists who are club members. If you hear applause in our audience, I'd note that members of the general public are also attending, so it is not necessarily evidence of a lack of journalistic objectivity. I'd like to welcome our C-SPAN and public radio audiences. You can follow the action on Twitter using the hashtag NPCLunch. After our guest speech concludes, we'll have a question and answer period. I will ask as many questions as time permits. Now it is time to introduce our head table guests. I'd ask each of you to stand briefly as your name is announced. From your right, Rebecca Metzler, political writer for U.S. News and World Report. Michael Lindenberger, Washington correspondent for the Dallas Morning News. Richard Salmon, Senior Associate Editor at Kiplinger and a former NPC president. Okay. I had it out of order there, sorry. Megan Cassell, a Washington Office Director of the Conservation Lands Foundation and a guest of the speaker. Mike Sorhan, a reporter at Energy Wire. Jeff Trandle, CEO of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and a guest of the speaker. Skipping over the podium, Allison Fitzgerald, finance editor for the Center for Public Integrity. Skipping over our speaker for the moment, Rod Cuckrow, freelance energy journalist and a member of the National Press Club Speakers Committee who organized today's event. Susan Page, bureau chief of USA Today. Nil Mulholland, president and CEO of the National Park Foundation and a guest of the speaker. Jennifer Delohe, energy reporter for Hearst Newspapers. And finally, Gary Gentile, senior writer at Platts. It was not even 6 months into her tenure as Secretary of the Interior that Sally Jewell and the agencies she manages became the public face of the 16-day federal government shutdown. The closure of national parks threatened to take such an economic toll on state economies that several governors offered to pay to reopen the parks, and that toll is significant. A report by Michigan State University released earlier this year put the value of parks to local communities at more than $30 billion a year, while supporting more than 250,000 jobs. Secretary Jewell is a political novice, something out of the norm compared to most of her predecessors. In administrations both Republican and Democrat, the pattern has been to appoint someone with political connections in Western states to be the shepherd of our nation's public lands. But Secretary Jewell brings with her other skills to the table, private sector skills. She began her career as a petroleum engineer in Oklahoma, and several years later began a 19-year stint in commercial banking. When President Obama tapped our speaker to lead the Interior Department, she was the CEO of outdoor recreation vendor REI. The nation's largest consumer cooperative had revenues of nearly $2 billion in 2012 and more than 5 million members. Maybe I could see a show of hands for those of you that ever purchased something at REI or are a member. Me too. Secretary Jewell's portfolio extends well beyond the 401 national park units. Her department plays a role in the stewardship of 20% of the nation's lands, including national wildlife refuges and vast areas of public lands, mostly in the West. Interior is the largest supplier and manager of water resources in 17 western states. It also manages the development of oil and gas as well as renewable energy on public lands and waters. Her love of the outdoors began with her family. As recent immigrants to Washington State from England, they would hike and camp frequently in the Pacific Northwest. That love continues this day, with Secretary Jewell skiing, kayaking, and climbing, most notably having completed 7 ascents of Mount Rainier. Her climbing enthusiasm continues today in Washington, where she is wearing out her staff, insisting that they accompany her on 12 flights of stairs to get to her 6th-floor office in the Interior Department headquarters. With that, please welcome to the National Press Club podium, Interior Secretary Sally Jewell.
Well, thank you, Tommy, for that thorough and entertaining introduction. Not necessarily fully accurate, but maybe somewhat close. And I want to thank the National Press Club for what you do to bring really thoughtful voices to issues that are sometimes complex, like what I'm going to talk about today. But before I start, I want to give a nod to Tommy's paper, which is the Salt Lake Tribune. And I want you to all pay attention to this because they're responsible for the best ever question that I've had from the media in my time as a professional. So my great colleague, Kate Kelly, somewhere around here, where's Kate? She does a really good job. Over there, hiding in the background. Kate called for the last question in this meeting I was having with the Salt Lake Tribune. And this individual said, I have a question. I was hiking in Grand Teton National Park, and there were warnings about bears everywhere. So I was walking along the trail, and I came across something on the trail that made me really nervous. And so I turned around and went back to my car, and I want to know if I really needed to go back to my car. So he held up his phone with a picture, and he said, is this bear poop? Isn't that great? And the good thing is, I actually knew the answer. And the answer was no, you could have kept on your hike. I mean, there may have been bears, but they weren't pooping there on the trail. It was a large ungulate that had pooped there a while ago. So, it was pretty obvious for those of you that know scat. Anyway, I have a broad portfolio at Interior, and I'm not going to try and cover the landscape at this time. My focus today is on the administration's conservation agenda, and that's what I'm going to concentrate my words today with. So as Tommy mentioned in the introduction, I've been in the private sector for a while. Even before I graduated from college, I worked on aspects of the Alaska pipeline, which is what got me into the oil and gas industry to begin with. As a banker, I learned about a ton of things, not just banking natural resources companies involved in timber or agriculture or mining or oil and gas, but also real estate and retail and all kinds of other businesses that make up this great country we've been a part of. And then at REI, yes, it's a big player in the industry, but the industry is 100 miles wide and a quarter of an inch deep. It's a $646 billion driver of economic activity to the United States. That's huge. It's bigger than pharmaceuticals. It's bigger than a number of industries that would surprise you. And that's outdoor recreation. So yes, REI is $2 billion. It seems big, but relative to outdoor recreation, it's not. And that's a very important part of our economy. And one of the reasons that I enthusiastically answered the president's call to take this job, because our public lands are important in so many ways. They drive our economies, but they also drive things that fill the soul and help define who we are as a nation. So at Interior, one of the main reasons I took this job is you've got to seize an opportunity to make a difference. We have a chance to make a difference at Interior on some of the defining issues of our time, like climate change, being out in the resource in so many places from 71 degrees north latitude to 7 degrees north latitude in one trip. You see the impacts of climate change everywhere. Like moving our country toward energy independence, which is also really important, but also honoring our proud conservation legacy. So I want to thank President Obama for his confidence in me, and I want to thank the Senate for agreeing with him and putting me in here as Secretary of Interior. So that's the job. Now the timing, that was a little off, right? I come into thinking great long-term, thinking about the future of our public lands, to a continuing resolution that's been funding us, a few months at a time since 2012. And then just as I started in April, sequestration hit. That is the nuttiest thing the business person has ever heard of, let me tell you. 5% across the board cuts, including the things that were most important that you really had to focus on had to get cut, along with things where you might say, that could wait a while. And so we had to cut across the board, and the impact was really severe. And so I hope this is behind us very soon. But most recently, the pièce de la résistance, the 16-day, absurd, wasteful government shutdown. I got to tell you, you had to have a sense of humor through that process because it's pretty frustrating. And so I have to tell you a story about a family friend that makes wine. and they sent me a bottle of wine, and they made it themselves, and the label was the Capitol Dome with a "Sorry, we're closed" sign on it. And the name of the wine, you gotta love this, Furlough Merlot. But I have to say, it hasn't been so funny to be a government employee. So before I keep going, I just want to have all the government employees that are in this room raise their hands so that we can all thank them. I know there's a bunch of you at this table. Raise your hands, guys. Let's give them a hand. So for more than 2 weeks, employees had to stay home from jobs that they loved. And they had to watch things on the news, and they wanted to be helpful, and they weren't allowed to be. The U.S. Geological Survey, which we all rely on a lot more than we know, had to hit pause on important scientific research, in some cases losing an entire year's worth of data because it was time sensitive to this season. The Bureau of Land Management, a complicated organization that manages vast lands, had to halt energy permitting on projects that were very important to industry. And Indian Affairs, the part of Interior that serves individuals directly, couldn't provide critical support to tribal nations. I got to tell you, that was very, very frustrating, whether you were working around the clock like some of us were, or whether you were forced to stay home and you wanted to be part of the solution. It was very frustrating. So I want you just to take a walk down what that 2 weeks was like with me. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the park ranger that had to call the bride and groom and say, "Sorry, that wedding you have planned in the national park? You're going to have to make other arrangements." There were something like a dozen weddings planned on some of the key spots around Washington, D.C. that had to be shuttered. There were weddings planned in national parks around the country. Or how about that Fish and Wildlife Service employee who is on to protect the resource but had to close the refuge, who's talking to the guide service that has clients that waited forever for that coveted tag to try and hunt a bighorn sheep that were told that they couldn't come to the refuge and hunt because it was closed. Public servants were forced to do the opposite of what they love and what they want to do, which is welcoming people to our public lands. So that's the human side. The shutdown also had a huge economic impact on local businesses and gateway communities that rely on public lands for their bread and butter. So a couple weeks ago, actually I guess it was last weekend, I thought, I'm new to this part of the country, I better go enjoy some of this fall foliage now that the shutdown's over. So I went to Shenandoah. And the trees were pretty bare at the top, but I descended 2,000 feet through some beautiful forests and back up the other side. In the West, you hike up to the destination and come down. It's different here. But I also visited with the park rangers, thanked them for being back on the job, learned a few of their stories, and the concessionaire, who there lost $2 million just in that 16-day period that they won't make up, because you're not going to get the October of 2013 back again that you lost. So all told, we estimate that the closure of the national park system alone, not including any of the other federal lands we talk about, costs local communities at least $76 million a day in lost revenue. But if there's a silver lining to all of this, and there's almost always some sort of a silver lining, it's that the shutdown shined a spotlight on just how much Americans love and value their public lands and the people who serve them. So, at the risk of you yelling at me later for putting a song in your head that won't go away, I am going to quote from a Joni Mitchell song. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? You can sing the rest. The shutdown clarified for all of us what's at stake. It reminded us that our parks, our wildlife refuges, and our public lands are uniquely ours. They're uniquely American. They're the places we go with our families to recreate, to seek beauty, to find solitude. They're our watersheds, our wildlife habitat. They're our economic engines. They're our sources of pride and history. They're where our diverse stories are celebrated. So this reminder about the value of our public lands has come at an important time in our history, when the demands on our lands and water are greater than ever. We've got a growing population, we have the very real effects of climate change, and we have constrained resources. And all of these things are coming together to place increasing pressures on our landscapes and waterways. At the same time, we stand at the doorstep of the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. In 2016, we'll celebrate what has been called America's best idea, the democratic concept that for the first time in human history, land would be set aside not for kings or the very rich, but for everybody. And next year will be the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, a historic bipartisan law that has resulted in millions of acres protected for the benefit of current and future generations of Americans. So in this country, at this time of year, you can go out and hear elk bugling. You can witness bears preparing their dens for the winter. You can see millions of birds flying south for the winter. So there are happy bird watchers and hunters and hikers and people out for a Sunday drive all over this country thanks to the lands that have been protected. So we stand together at this juncture. It's very important now that we think about what conservation legacy we want to leave for the next 50 years or the next 100 years. Do we want a legacy of short-sighted funding and partisan gridlock that we've witnessed in Congress over the last few years? I don't think so. I'm thinking in particular about some members of the House of Representatives who've proposed to slash funding for the National Park Service by 13%, or gut the Fish and Wildlife Service by nearly a third, or cut $100 million from the Bureau of Land Management's operating budget, and that is one agency that operates at a bare bones level. I'm also thinking about a Congress that since 2010 hasn't acted to protect a single new acre of public land as a national park, a monument, or a wilderness area. Not one. Or do we want a legacy of people I've met, like Jim and Carol Falstich, who are ranchers in South Dakota, who are leading an effective grassroots effort to protect, with private landowners like themselves, to protect the prairie potholes region and the key habitat for ducks and other waterfowl, this area of our country that's been called the nation's duck factory. About 50% of our waterfowl come through the prairie potholes. Or like Lefty Durando. He's a rancher in Florida who's working with the Fish and Wildlife Service and other private landowners to conserve the Everglades headwaters and to pass on our nation's ranching heritage to the next generation, but also provide clean water to 7 million people in South Florida. And, oh, by the way, restore that river of grass, that ecosystem that is so important. It's one of the most noted in the world. Or how about the people I worked with when I was back in my home community of Seattle, and many, many like them around the country, who work with states and communities to pass measures every year to fund open spaces and build new parks. I know where President Obama stands on this. The president believes that we have a moral obligation to the next generation to leave our land, our water, and wildlife better than we found it. That's why he launched the America's Great Outdoors program in 2010, and I was pleased as a business person to participate in that. That's why he's taking comprehensive action to cut carbon pollution and slow the effects of climate change that I've seen every time I've been out in the resource. And that's why he's used his authority time and again to protect some of the places that Americans love most. In my conversations with the president, he's told me how his visits to national parks and seashores with his mom and his grandmother shaped him as a young man, and how he shared that same experience with his daughters at the rim of the Grand Canyon, a place that was set aside for future generations, even as our country then was growing by leaps and bounds. In remarks last year, President Obama invoked the words of Aldo Leopold, reminding us that conservation is not just about doing nothing. It's about doing something affirmative to make sure that we're passing along this incredible blessing that we have. So I look forward to working with the president, my colleagues in the cabinet, and Congress, as well as local communities across this country as we enter the second century of American conservation. So how do we get there? Well, at a start, Congress should get back to regular order, please, and pass the president's budget, or a budget that's close to that. And I will say that there are members of the House and the Senate who understand these issues, and they're very supportive. Congress needs to deliver a sustainable, thoughtful budget that supports our parks, our forests, our refuges, our rivers, and conservation lands, and in turn strengthens our economy, particularly the economy in rural areas. Because the real test of whether you support conservation is not what you say at a press conference, even though I understand those are important, but whether you fight for it in the budget conference. That's where the rubber hits the road. Congress also needs to fulfill a promise made to Americans through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, or what we call LWCF. LWCF is an innovative program that since 1964, coming up on its 50th anniversary, has used revenues from offshore oil and gas development, and we know there are impacts of offshore oil and gas development, to enhance parks and open spaces in every county across the country. Personally, in my home state of Washington, the other Washington, LWCF funds have been used to do things like pay for easements for hunters to have access to lands that are important to them, or to provide matching grants to communities that want to improve local parks or set aside open spaces as they grow. This program, LWCF, was an early, important, and visionary effort at balancing the impact of development with the opportunity to support public lands and resources. So rather than zeroing out the fund, as some have proposed to do, Congress should adopt President Obama's budget proposal to enact mandatory full funding of LWCF by 2015. This is money that has been going into the Treasury every year since 1964 that was set aside for this, and it's only been funded once at its full allocated level since its enactment, and it's time to do that fully. Congress should also continue to fund other key successful programs like the North American Wetlands Conservation Grants to fuel our work with communities, hunters, and landowners. And finally, Congress needs to get moving to pass dozens of locally supported bills introduced by both Republicans and Democrats that protect the places that Americans care about most and places that their constituents have said are important to them. Like the Omnibus Public Lands Act, where the President and Congress worked together in 2009 to protect 2 million acres of wilderness and designate over 1,100 miles of wild and scenic river. These are the kind of common sense, bipartisan actions that Americans want to see Congress take. But we cannot and we will not hold our breath forever. We owe it to future generations to act. So just as the President has already demonstrated on 9 occasions, he's ready and willing to step up where Congress falls short. The national monuments and national wildlife refuges that he has established over the last 4 years provide important protections for special places, like the Rio Grande del Norte in New Mexico, or they preserve key chapters in our nation's story, like that of Cesar Chavez or Harriet Tubman. There are many more special places just like that, and many more stories that need to be told. In the coming weeks and months, I will be on the road, I'll be meeting with communities, I'll be evaluating opportunities where action can ensure that our nation's stories and landscapes are honored, celebrated, and preserved for the generations to come. So the next topic I want to cover deals with what some see as the quintessential issue for Interior. This is a difficult agency. We have a lot of priorities that we balance. Specifically, how do we strike the right balance for development and conservation to ensure that we serve our nation's needs now and far into the future? So part of this is encouraging development in the right ways and in the right places. Part of that is recognizing there's some places that are too special to develop. And I've been to one of them. I've been to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's an amazing place. My first evening there, I counted 29 polar bears who had left the ice to come to shore to find food. It is an extraordinary place, and you never look at nature quite the same way when you've been there. Today, we have an unprecedented opportunity using science and technology to create a better understanding of landscapes than ever before, to advance important conservation goals and achieve our development objectives together. It's not an either-or. It can't be. We're already seeing this approach work as we seek to meet President Obama's goal of approving 20,000 megawatts of renewable energy on public lands by 2020. It's a goal toward which my predecessor, Ken Salazar, made huge strides. For example, in Southern California, we're working with the state on something called the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. It's an ambitious plan to cite renewable energy, but also to understand conservation objectives. In that region, we're going to be blending science and satellite data, identifying the areas of highest energy potential, but also high priority conservation lands in the Mojave Desert. It's interesting because I happen to know 2 young scientists who both did some of their early work after graduating from school by counting desert tortoises. And I knew nothing about why they were counting desert tortoises until I came to this job. And they were doing work on behalf of the USGS and the Fish and Wildlife Service to understand this habitat. So we've also, beyond the desert, southwest in the Mojave Desert, we've also employed this landscape level approach in Alaska, where we took a comprehensive look at the National Petroleum Reserve to protect over 13 million acres, like key caribou habitat around Teshekpuk Lake, while also making available for development 72% of the estimated economically recoverable oil. So I was in the North Slope, Barrow, Alaska, meeting with the Inupiaq people who reminded me of the importance of caribou, not only for subsistence, but also for their cultural traditions, but also told me that energy development was important to them. It's economic activity that helps give them jobs and fuels their local economy. These are both important, but it's also important for us to get it right. So the type of smart, balanced approach to development is especially what we need in new frontiers like the Arctic, or in the development of master leasing plans, or in places like the Bakken region of North Dakota, where we're experiencing a major energy boom. I went and visited the Bakken. Some of you have probably seen pictures of the development going on there. And I will say, it's also right on the boundary of Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And I think I saw Teddy over there. Welcome. I know it's Halloween, but I think you just come back from the dead to join us. So we're taking care of your park, except there's oil and gas development going near it, and we're trying to work on that. So I just have to say, during that visit, where I learned a lot about how companies were directionally drilling to have a smaller footprint on the land than the drilling methods that were used when I was in the industry, I also went out to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and I met with Superintendent Naylor, who just got an award for the work that she did in working with developers there to help them recognize the impact of development on the national park. And she described it as something like playing whack-a-mole, where just as she thought she had one area protected and had worked with companies who were going to develop there, and they decided to move based on a conversation with her, she had someone else over here. And she said, I live in fear of taking a few days off. We want to help people like Superintendent Naylor, because she's just one of hundreds of superintendents or wildlife refuge managers around the country that understand the critical nature of the landscapes surrounding their park or their refuge or the public land, and want to be able to work closely with businesses to understand what's at stake so that everybody can make smarter decisions. So under my leadership at Interior, we will always take the long view, even when our budgets don't. And we will always, always keep in mind that public lands are a trust, one that we manage for generations to come. That's why today I'm issuing my first secretarial order to ensure that whenever our public lands and resources are impacted by development activity, we're also considering how to mitigate these impacts at a landscape level through strategic conservation and restoration. So as a business person, I appreciate there's an important role for government to play in overseeing how our lands are developed. We rely as business people on government making those kinds of choices. I also know that there's nothing more frustrating than to be well into an investment and find your investment challenged. It gives you uncertainty. It results oftentimes in costly delays and perhaps lawsuits. But by understanding our landscapes and guiding development to the areas of highest resource value and lowest environmental concern, we can reduce the likelihood of conflict. We can help businesses drive a more predictable return on investment, and that's what they're looking for. When there are environmental impacts, businesses are going to be able to support meaningful landscape-level environmental needs rather than ad hoc project-by-project mitigation efforts. I know from my own experience that businesses want to be good stewards of the land and the areas that they live in, where their people live, where they grow up. They don't want to be part of the problem, they want to be part of the solution. This secretarial order and the work that my colleagues are going to do in Interior is going to help them do that. So finally, I can't stress enough the importance of engaging the next generation in understanding and stewarding public lands, something I was passionate about in my last job and will continue to be passionate as long as I'm on this earth. The millennial generation, representing my children, now young adults aged 18 to 33, is larger, it's more urban, and it's more diverse than any generation in our history. But research also shows that this generation cares deeply about the planet and wants to make a difference in their careers. Yet they've grown up being more disconnected from the natural world than ever before, and I could spend an entire speech talking to you just about that. This generation, the millennial generation, already outnumbers the boomer generation, my own, by 3 million people. By 2030, it'll outnumber us by 22 million. That's because a bunch of us are going to die. But this millennial generation will soon be our elected officials, our business leaders, our parents, our public servants. And what happens when we have a generation who has had little connection to our nation's public lands, yet they're suddenly in charge of taking care of them? What happens? So at Interior, this is a very real question. About a third of our 70,000 strong workforce will be eligible to retire within 5 years. We're going to need a whole new generation of wildlife biologists, of park rangers, of scientists, and other professionals to care for our lands and waters. Unfortunately, the entry-level jobs that we've relied on so much, like seasonal ranger jobs or interns or trail crews or research assistants, have been severely impacted by the indiscriminate nature of sequestration and the lack of flexibility in how we spend our limited resources. That is the one area that was whacked the most by the nature of sequestration, and we've got to get back to regular order. This is happening at a time when many of these young people are entering the workforce, and they're entering the workforce in a really tough time in our economy to find a job. So for the health of our economy, our public lands, and future generations, it's critical that we work now to establish meaningful and deep connections between young people from all backgrounds in all parts of this country and the great outdoors. So today I'm pleased to announce an ambitious initiative in Interior that we'll undertake over the next 4 years to inspire millions of young people to play, to learn, to serve, and to work in the outdoors. First, we're going to develop and enhance partnerships in 50 cities. These are cities where we'll create better opportunities for outdoor play for more than 10 million young people. Nearly 80% of our population lives in cities today, and many of these cities have open spaces that are pretty few and far between. There are programs administered by the National Park Service that have been hugely successful. Urban Parks and Recreation Program, Rivers and Trails Conservation Assistance Program. These are things that communities have relied on for a long time. And here in Washington, D.C., when many of our parks and open spaces are run by the National Park Service, you certainly felt what that like when it went away, right? Haynes Point or Rock Creek Park, where you couldn't go, and you would have before unless you went and you weren't supposed to. Anacostia Park, Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens, they go on and on. We're very fortunate here. We actually have some pretty incredible public resources, but we need to bring those to other cities. Second, we're going to use the nation's best classrooms, the natural world, to provide educational opportunities to at least 10 million of the nation's K-12 students annually. So just earlier this week, I was out at Dyke Marsh. It's near Alexandria. It's right along the Mount Vernon Trail. It's part of the GW Parkway, and it's a beautiful natural area that has been eroding dramatically since dredging activities happened some decades ago. I was announcing that we would be rebuilding a lot of that wetland by putting in some containment things to bring back the natural marshes. But most importantly, there were 2 school groups out there from Alexandria, young kids representing all the colors of the rainbow and all the enthusiasm that only young children can have, telling me about the pH and the water quality. And out there with their instructors. These are the best classrooms. And when you've got kids in particular that are bouncing off the walls, and I could ask for a show of hands about how many of you have them, because I'm sure it's a lot, how about putting them in a classroom that has no walls? That's what we can do. Third, we're setting a goal of engaging 1 million volunteers in support of public lands by 2016, effectively tripling the numbers that we have right now. I've served on many trail crews, and I know that volunteering, for me, establishes a connection to place like nothing else. A couple weeks ago, I was in Rock Creek Park with the Rock Creek Conservancy, undercover, removing invasive English ivy from the trees in the park. I'll never look at Rock Creek Park the same way. I now understand how invasives are playing a role there. It also gave me a chance to get to know some people that I otherwise wouldn't have gotten to know. This does, in fact, change lives. And by ramping up a modern version, a 2.0 version of the Civilian Conservation Corps, what we call 21st Century Conservation Service Corps. Interior, U.S. Department of Agriculture, other agencies of the federal family are going to work with AmeriCorps, Student Conservation Association, and other youth corps and veterans groups from around the country to give many more young people these kinds of opportunities that will, in fact, change their lives. So when I was in the Grand Tetons, I had the privilege of engaging with a group of young people that were graduating from the National Park Service Academy, which is something that the superintendent of that park, along with the Student Conservation Association, invented. And these young people from urban areas around the country were talking about their stories. And there was one young man from Jackson, Mississippi, who was a pretty cool guy, I'll tell you. And he talked about first being so cold when he went there in the springtime, because it wasn't like Jackson, and then being there through the summer and riding his bike along the Moose Wilson Road and stopping and looking at the vast Tetons and starting to cry. And he said, I didn't know why I was crying. But it's very clear that this experience in the outdoors moved him. It changed his life, and it can do so with many, many others. So finally, to generate the next generation of stewards of our public lands and to ensure our own skilled and diverse workforce, Interior and other federal land management agencies will provide 100,000 work and training opportunities to young people over the course of the next 4 years. That's hard. There's no doubt it's ambitious, especially in tight budget times. And in order to make it happen, we're going to have to prioritize our budgets. We're going to have to build off successful programs and work in partnership with schools, with nonprofit organizations and communities to leverage existing resources. And we're also going to work with corporate and nonprofit organizations to raise an additional $20 million over 4 years to support these youth work and training opportunities. I know as a business person, businesses want to be part of the solution. I know there are many organizations and individuals that want to see our lands protected and the next generation engaged. And I will pledge to them that we will make sure our taxpayer dollars and our philanthropic contributions work together to make that happen. So in closing, we're continuing to move ahead in fulfilling our mission at the department. As stewards of our public lands, wildlife, and waters, as managers of our great national parks, in partnership with tribal nations, with states and stakeholders, we will meet the needs of the present generation without sacrificing the rich legacy that we pass on to future generations. This is our commitment to all Americans, and this is my personal commitment to you. It's no different than the promise made by Teddy Roosevelt over a century ago. And Teddy, you can check my words. As he described what he called a great moral issue, he said, I recognize the right and duty of this generation to develop and use the natural resources of our land. But I do not recognize the right to waste them or to rob, by wasteful use, the generations that come after us. Of all the questions which can come before this nation, short of the actual preservation of its existence in a great war, there is none which compares in importance with the great central task of leaving this land even a better land for our descendants than it is for us, and training them into a better race to inhabit the land and pass it on. Conservation is a great moral issue, for it involves the patriotic duty of ensuring the safety and continuance of the nation. So as we look to the next 100 years of this nation, the next century of the National Park Service, or the next 5 decades of the Wilderness Act, these words from Roosevelt should serve as a call to action and inspiration to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. We covered a lot of topics there, including bear poop, which I don't think we've talked about over the microphone here before, but thank you for that. We have a range of topics to ask questions on today, but let me start with one of the most pressing ones recently because of the shutdown. Parks Director Jonathan Jarvis took a lot of heat over the closures of Washington monuments like World War II. Was there any political motivation behind the barriers that were erected around the national parks?
In 2 words, absolutely not. You know, I've learned a lot of things over the course of 6 months, but particularly over the course of the last few weeks. One is the Anti-Deficiency Act of 1870 and the criminal penalties that it causes if you put people on staff that do anything other than protecting life and property. So the people of the National Park Service did not want to barricade the monuments, but the monuments don't take care of themselves. So we had park police to protect, but normally there'd be about 300 people on staff that are walking the mall, taking care of visitors, picking up garbage, cleaning the restrooms, maintaining the grounds, interpreting what's there, and they were not allowed to come to work. So the barricades were there to protect the resources, and we worked as best as we could. And I know the honor flights from the World War II thanked us for making every accommodation we could within the letter of the law to help the veterans see the monuments that they wanted to see, but do it in a way that also fulfilled our obligation under the Anti-Deficiency Act and the decision to close the parks. So absolutely no political motivation.
So, since we're talking about the shutdown, do you have any more of a refined estimate of what the government closure costs local economies near the country's major national parks? And following up on that, the questions come from several members of Congress that the Interior Department repaid the states for running the parks during the shutdown in 95, 96. Why can't you do that now?
That's what I call a multiple probe, 2 questions at once. So the first question, we know that national parks generate about $76 million a day in economic activity. Every day is not equal. Every park's not, generating as much activity at the same time. So we're still tallying the numbers to try and understand that. I do know that for concessionaires, people were furloughed and they did not get paid. People were let go, food spoiled. There's a lot of loss associated with that can't just be made up with what they would normally make in economic activity. So still working on those numbers. We don't know them. What was the second one?
Sorry. Why didn't you repay the states?
Oh, okay, it's the states. So it's misinformation. The states in 1995 were not repaid for money they gave. In fact, what happened, and it was only one state, it was the state of Arizona, they agreed to pay, they sent a deposit in, the shutdown ended, and the deposit was sent back. So there actually wasn't any money kept by the federal government in 1995, and we had to do some digging back in the historical records to understand that. But our records are going to be much more helpful should this crazy thing ever happen again. Hopefully memories are longer than they were last time and we won't have to go through it. But there was never any federal money repaid to the states last go-around or this go-around.
A little bit of breaking news today. Senate Republicans today blocked 2 Obama nominees, Mel Watt for the Housing Agency and Patricia Ann Millett for U.S. Court of Appeals. As somewhat of a newbie to Washington, what do you say about what does this say about how Washington works or doesn't work, and how does this impact you with so many unfilled positions at the Interior Department?
I've never seen anything like it in my life. It's very different than the private sector. Very, very different. It takes a little bit longer, has all kinds of complications. But I'm confident that we will round out a strong team at Interior led by Mike Connor. Mike, could you just give a wave, even though it's not your style? Mike is nominee to be Deputy Secretary of the Department of Interior. Fantastic, knowledgeable resource, brings a great depth of background. He's through the Senate committee. They have agreed to forward his nomination to the full Senate, and he's in that list that's waiting to get voted on by the full Senate, which we hope will be very soon. Or Rhea Sue, yesterday, nominated by the President to be the Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, currently serving as Assistant Secretary for Policy Management and Budget. These are 2 terrific individuals. We hope we'll be through the process very quickly. Certainly there are other people that are serving in an acting capacity in the Department of the Interior, and I am treating them as though they're going to be there forever. We are not waiting for this long and laborious process to keep things moving because we've got important work to do. And the team that's there, whether they're acting or they are permanently in the positions, well, as permanent as these positions are, they are all working together to make sure we drive the agendas and the priorities forward without having to wait for the nominations. But again, we hope that they happen fast.
Presidents usually take the opportunity to name some big national monuments. I think all presidents have done so. They don't need to go to Congress by using the Antiquities Act. The president could do that. What are some of the areas that may be under consideration for national monuments, and will the president use the Antiquities Act to name them?
Well, the president has used the Antiquities Act 9 times so far in his administration, and certainly if Congress doesn't step up to act to protect some of these important places that have been identified by communities and people throughout the country, then the president will take action. I think it's consistently true that every action that he has taken has resulted from a support that's come from the community, where the community has said, this is special, we want you to protect it. So that will continue to happen. There are places all over the country. As I mentioned in my remarks, I'll be going out to visit some of them. I'll be meeting with community members. I'll be understanding why these places are special before we go forward with any actions. But there's no question that if Congress doesn't act, we will act. We'll also say that there are dozens of bills in the House and or the Senate right now that have been identified by both Republicans and Democrats that are special areas that they want to set aside. So it would be great if they took action and they set those lands aside, just like happened in the Omnibus Public Lands Act of 2009. Both of those are mechanisms that we hope will be used to recognize these special places and to take care of them.
Just to follow up on that, would the president act to use the Antiquities Act in any case where the local community objected?
I said throughout my confirmation hearing that we would be working with the local communities. Now, does that mean everything has to have 100% support? I guess I haven't seen anything yet where everybody agrees on everything, but certainly where there's a groundswell of support, we will focus our energies. We won't be focusing on our energies where there's a tremendous amount of conflict.
You talked about climate change for a little bit. There are critics on all sides of climate change, of course. Some are saying Interior is punishing oil and gas industries in favor of renewables, and others saying you haven't done enough to push renewables. How do you see the fit?
Energy is important. It drives our economy. We're sitting under lights here. We've got cameras rolling, and those are all driven by electrons that have to be produced somewhere. The President made it clear that he had an all-of-the-above energy strategy, and that's something that I embrace and I understand. I'm also really proud of what the Department of Interior has done to stand up renewable energy programs around the country. We've announced several offshore wind lease sales, innovative way of doing master lease planning to work out conflicts and to put areas that have high wind potential and low conflict, like I was talking about with landscape level understanding and conservation. Worked on solar plans like the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. These are important utility scale plans that provide renewable energy to supplement the non-renewable energy sources we have, but both are being done, and across the landscape, Interior works with companies that are involved in both conventional and unconventional renewables or non-renewables and renewables, and that's what we expect to continue to do. You can't just switch off a major part of our energy source and expect the economy to thrive. You have to do it in a thoughtful way over a long period of time, and I think that we're striking that right balance.
For years, certain members of Congress have been arguing the Interior Department should not purchase more land to expand parks, wildlife refuges, and other federal lands with critical wildlife habitat until the maintenance backlog in existing holdings is eliminated. I believe Senator Coburn had a report this week on that subject. What are your thoughts about the idea of the Interior not taking care of what it has already and therefore shouldn't purchase more? And would that, what would be put at risk if your department would not be able to acquire new properties?
So this is a common refrain that people toss around. Frequently, I will say the same people that squeeze our budgets so we end up with a larger maintenance backlog. You can solve a maintenance backlog, yes. You solve a maintenance backlog by taking care of the maintenance backlog. It's not that complicated. And as a business person, that's what we did on a regular basis. That's what kept the economy going. So this is really, I just have to editorialize. It's very, very hard to run something on a month-to-month or year-to-year basis when you're talking about assets that last for a long time. So, well, in perpetuity. How about that for a long time? The circumstance that you described, Tommy, is, I'd say it's a common fallacy. So I was out in the Tetons, as I mentioned. There is a large tract of land in the Tetons, in the middle of the Teton Valley, owned by the state, that if we aren't able to buy from the state, will get developed. And it is really critical habitat. One parcel right in the pronghorn elk migration. Another one right in the beautiful valley below the Tetons, which has no development at all, and it would all be mega mansions. These aren't areas that are going to cost the Park Service any more to maintain, but these are critical land holdings that the state wants to sell, the community wants us to find a way to buy, and the Park Service wants to buy. So, I mean, that's an illustration. There is money in the Land and Water Conservation Fund that goes to supporting easements. You've got a willing property owner that would like to support hunting access or fishing access or access for rock climbing across their property. They want to sell a conservation easement to do that, and money gets used for that as well. So to make the simplistic correlation that putting money into our lands necessarily causes more in maintenance is just incorrect. But I will say, I do hope that Congress steps up and provides us a more rational budget to take care of these special places that many of them have in fact set aside. I will also say that many of the members that are very critical out in the public, when I'm meeting with them in their offices, want a national park in their district.
Let me get very specific here for a second. 13% of all oil drilling and fracturing is done on BLM land right now. Will that number rise or go down in the future?
I'm going to talk about fracking for a second, because I fracked wells before. Probably not a lot of you out there. How many others have fracked a well in this room? Okay, I could say anything I wanted. Fracking has been an important tool in the toolbox for oil and gas for over 50 years. And some of the new techniques that are being used actually reduce the amount of footprint on the surface acreage in order to address and recover oil and gas from a much larger area. So this is an important tool, but it has to be done safely and responsibly. And the BLM is working on regulations that some of you are aware of that are going to do just that. We have a number of opportunities to continue to develop oil and gas on BLM lands, and we will continue to see that happen. So if you take example I used earlier of the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska, you want to make sure you minimize the surface impact for a whole variety of reasons. Species migration, sensitive ecosystem, permafrost, all of those kinds of things. By using directional drilling and fracking, they have an opportunity to have a softer footprint on the land, but that's a lot of acreage that the BLM has that will be developed. So short answer to your question is we'll likely do more because we'll be leasing more land to do it, but we're going to do it in a safe and responsible way.
The National Academy of Sciences released a review almost 150 days ago on the BLM's controversial wild horse program, saying, quote, continuation of business as usual practices will be expensive and unproductive for BLM and the public it serves, end quote. Does the Interior Department and BLM intend to embrace the reforms included in the report, and if so, when, or would they not?
Well, the question about how we effectively manage the wild horse and burro program is one that people feel very passionately about on both sides of the issue. It's difficult. There isn't a Secretary of Interior that I've talked to, and I've talked to them going back to the 1970s, that hasn't been aware of this issue and struggled with this issue. So I want to start by saying it's not easy. It's actually quite difficult. The National Academy of Sciences gave us a report. It was very helpful in a couple of ways. One is it validated what our land managers know, which is horses are really good at reproducing. 20% a year. That means the herd doubles in size every 3.5 years. That's a lot of horses, and providing they have forage, that gives them an opportunity to continue to grow very dramatically and not in a sustainable way, which the National Academy of Sciences also pointed out. Birth control is an alternative that the National Academy of Sciences report suggested, and we're certainly supportive of that. Challenge is, in the veterinary world of pharmaceuticals, you don't have the same controls or the same products as you do in the human world of pharmaceuticals. And we would love to have a stronger partnership with the pharmaceutical industry to come up with a more effective birth control method than what's available out there, because it's very expensive and it doesn't work for a very long period of time. And oh, by the way, you have to get the horses there to give them the birth control. I know there's some things you could do with stallions too, but I won't get into that. This is a big issue. It's an issue that's been around for decades. It's an issue that we care about, that we want to manage on a sustainable way. I'm not going to be able to fix it overnight. National Academy of Sciences gave us some good data. We have budget constraints. We have all kinds of alternatives that we're considering, and so We're working on it. We're going to continue to work on it, and I would love this to be a call to action to the pharmaceutical industry to help us develop an effective birth control method that we can use on horses that would, I think, help this problem get solved. Thanks.
The Colorado River is the lifeline to much of the Southwest, including my home state of Utah. Yet it is a finite resource and being tapped more and more. As the population of the Southwest continues to increase and warming temperatures decrease the mountain snowpack, what can Interior do to ensure the river doesn't get tapped out?
I like these little questions that you've got for me.
That's right.
So I'm going to watch Mike Connor and see how much he squirms as I answer, which because Mike is very, very knowledgeable on this topic. One of the this is an interesting job. Besides Secretary of the Interior, I have these other titles that the job entails, and one of them is the Water Master for the Lower Colorado River. Sounds pretty lofty. Mike and his colleagues in the Bureau of Reclamation introduced me to a really smart group of people from the states who are along the Colorado River. And really, it's states that manage the water rights. And Bureau of Reclamation has a pretty big job to do, like Hoover Dam, Glen Canyon Dam, other dams downstream, in managing the stream flows and working with the states and frankly, keeping this coalition together. They've also, at Reclamation, been working on something called Water Smart, which is just like being sensible about how we use energy and electricity, being really sensible at how we use water. We don't want to waste water. We want our canals, in some cases, if they can be covered, there's less evaporation. If we can prevent leaks, obviously that's water that's being wasted. There's things that we can do to make sure that every drop of water gets to its intended source. But there's also increasing demand. So working with states to identify better methods of using water more sustainably that also support ecosystem needs is exactly what this group of very smart people from all the states along the Colorado River have been working on in conjunction with my colleagues at the Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Geological Survey, and others. So it's a big job, and it's all of our job to use water more wisely than we have in the past, because there's an awful lot that can be done just in how we use it, whether for agriculture or municipal uses or other uses. And this is something that this team of people working behind the scenes is working carefully to do, because you're right. Climate change is upon us. You see it in droughts throughout the West. We see it in the Colorado River. If you look at the levels in Lake Powell or Lake Mead or any of the other lakes that are in that region, you will see that we have a huge problem. And by the way, we share this river with Mexico, which is where Mike was just a few days ago. So these are important and not easy issues, but they're issues that are being addressed by some very, very smart people at both the state and the federal level, and locals.
We're almost out of time, but before asking the last question, we have a couple of housekeeping matters to take care of. First of all, I'd like to remind you of our upcoming events and speakers. November 5th, next week, I believe that's Election Day, Goldie Hawn, the actress and founder of the Hawn Foundation, will be here at the National Press Club. November 7th, former Senator Judd Gregg, CEO of Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association, will be here. Gregg plans to unveil protections for investors to be endorsed by the banking group. November 11th, Walt Bettinger, President and CEO of the Charles Schwab Corporation, will be here. Secondly, I would like to present our guest with the traditional NPC mug. I'm sorry it didn't come from REI, but finally, for our last question, I think we wanted to ask the most pressing issue for those of us who live here in Washington: when will the Washington Monument reopen?
We hope to have it open a year from now. There are people who kind of like its exoskeleton, and you know, I have a wonderful job, but it's made more wonderful by some of the places I can go. There's been a few places where I said, "Could I do this?" And they say, "Ma'am, you can go any place you want." So one of those was I got to climb up the stairs to the scaffolding and then the ladder that went right up to the top of the monument and look down. So I kind of like that exoskeleton for a while, but does anybody have the exact date at the table here? Do you remember? Kate, you remember when we're going to reopen? No? Okay, so pretty sure it's a year from now. I did ask that question recently, and it just went in one ear and out the other, but it's not going to be long. Thanks.
We will invite you back to give us the exact date at a later point. How about a round of applause for our speaker today? Thank you all for coming today. I'd also like to thank the National Press Club staff, including its Journalism Institute and Broadcast Center, for organizing today's event. Finally, here's a reminder that you can find more information about the National Press Club on our website. Also, if you'd like to get a copy of today's program, please check out our website at www.press.org. Thank you. We are adjourned. That was great.
Oh, thank
Sorry
you.
for all the little questions. They have like 10
No,
million
you
different things.
got lots of them. No, they were fine. That was good.
No, that was a really good discussion. We got a lot of
You like my bear poop?
I did. I want to know who the reporter was.